So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Steve to get the webinar started.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's good to be back again. Yesterday, we talked about more of a foundational approach to cover crops, soil health, no-till. Today, we're going to focus more on how to effectively communicate with those we influence. It's kind of a paraphrase of the title that we promoted. I would just mention too, with the attendees here, the people who signed up, it appears that about 1/4 or about 25% is farmers, identified themselves as farmers. So this topic today is more focused on, we'll call it train the trainers, or those who actually influence, meaning consultants and maybe those in the public ag sector or education, wherever. So we're going to be focusing a little bit more on that. But I will say to you farmers joining today that there'll be some key things that you'll, I think, find informative and just helpful in how you communicate, because you are influencing others, and farmers really can influence other farmers greatly. So I just want to say that in the outset. So from soil health message to on-farm implementation, you know, we can talk 4 days here about this, but if we make no difference out there, it's just no value really. So I want to make this very, very practical from a standpoint of communication. And then after I'm finished, we have our guest Lisa Blazer here today, talking about more on the water side of things. So that outlines it. So you ready to dive in? Okay, let's go. So some of the 4 key components I want to cover today is how to be great at connecting with farmers, communicating the proper mindset, and we talked about that yesterday, so I'll be reflecting back a little bit on that. How to have an awesome field day, and that's something that's we know is very effective. To be able to see what we're talking about is always helpful. And then how to confidently lead a discussion. Some of you have natural talent with all this. Some of you don't. And we all can learn. So that's the point of what we're trying to do here today. So let's start off with the basics. Again, it has to do with personality. How can you be relatable? Well, there's some practical things that any of you can do. And if you know anything about farming or farmers, we always talk about the weather. And when we call someone up, usually on the phone, one of the first things we talk about is, hey, how's the weather? Especially if it's someone out of the area, or if it's close, how much rain did you get last night? If you don't say that, you're just not, it's just something you always do. So I'm suggesting to those of you who are not farmers to get a rain gauge, so that when you communicate with farmers after a rain, you can really make yourself look relatable. If you ask them, well, how much rain did you have? And you can say, well, I had 410 or whatever you have. And if you really want to get impressive, tell them you had 4,500ths. And now that just really takes you up a notch. So when I had my seed business, I had quite a few employees, and I told them all to get rain gauges so that when they talk on the phone to customers, they would know this. And they told me how significant that was. And so that's just one little thing. Another thing is, if you're not a farmer, but your primary job is relating to farmers, don't just relate to them when your job requires it. If there is a local fair, or an example I had was we had a local farm sale. And I was there and I saw my seed corn dealer there. Now, this was a seed corn dealer who was his full-time job. He was not a farmer. And I said, why are you here at this sale today? He said, I'm here to see my customers on a non-sales basis. I thought that was really cool. And he was there to build rapport, to build relationship, because that goes a long way in building the respect that you have with those that you communicate with. When you don't always see them in the context of either making a sale, giving them advice, or whatever, it gets you in the loop, in the group, so to speak. And that leads right into the next point, understanding the culture of agriculture. Now, I'll say this, it's hard to understand the culture of agriculture unless you grow up with it. And farmers can usually sniff that out almost immediately. I know I sure can. If someone's coming here, they may have a product that they want to sell me, but if they don't understand that I'm harvesting corn and they would like to stop and talk to me, I'm not stopping. And don't try to just quickly get your 1 minute spiel in either. That doesn't work. I am focused. I'm busy. Don't bother me today, please. So that's just a little thing, but try to get an understanding of the culture of agriculture. The other thing too, the last thing I have here, and this does more or less relate to your personality, is value being respected over being right. It's a fine line sometimes, but I just want to encourage you to think about that in your relationships. Another thing too is, and I know for some of you this is just old information, but I know it's going to help others as well. But how about those that you interact with, your clients, whoever it is? What is their tendency? So when we're talking about cover crops, we're talking about soil health here. There's some people out there that they've always farmed the way they farm. They're not going to change. And I'm going to give some examples later on. Then you have others who are like, well, I'll listen to if you can tell me it's profitable. Show me the money. And the third group here is you have people that'll try anything as long as it seems to have merit. They'll try on a small scale. And then you always have one or two that they kind of fall for everything. If it's a new idea, they're in. I think you realize that number 1 and number 4 are probably people you might not want to invest as much time in, just because. And you have to discern that. I know there's a lot of other things, but number 2 and 3 is the people you want to focus on when you're trying to communicate, trying to be effective. You need to focus on the right people. There's a saying that you got to be careful of spending 80% of your time on 20% of your clients' needs. You're not really affecting as much. You want to spend more time with those who will amplify your message. And I've heard it said already too, and this is tough if you're in sales, a bad client is worse than no client because they can suck a lot of energy out and they require an awful lot of help and follow-up questions and everything, which can be good, but sometimes a bad client is not a good manager and ends up that, well, cover crops don't work around here. And when you get to that point, we're going to talk about it a little bit later, but when you get to that point, it causes you to question where you need to value your most time. A good client will amplify your message. Another thing, and this applies more to those who do public speaking and having meetings, doing webinars, and so forth. And by the way, it's one thing to do a live presentation. It's another thing to do a webinar. Those of you who have done that know that. When you're speaking live, you can kind of feed off the audience. When you're not, like today, I'm sitting here in a room all by myself. And to get into to picture the people out there and everything is a different dynamic that you have to get used to. So sharpen your speaking skills. Get books and read books. I've done that. I've gotten books. One of my favorite books is by John Maxwell called Everybody Communicates, but Few Connect. It's all about connecting. You can stand there and listen to someone all day and they say they know a lot about nothing, I like to say, but you want to be able to connect with your audience. So observe great speakers. When you're at a meeting and you're like, that was a really good speaker, think to yourself, why was that? What did they do that captured your attention? Just the nuances of some things are important to kind of pick them out and think how you can employ that at some point. So resource yourself with, I call it tips of the trade. And there's a lot of things you can do. There's a lot of TED Talks that are out there that you can listen to. That'll make you a more effective communicator because we're trying to get the message of cover crops out there. What happens when you don't know the answer to a question someone gives you? Well, typically, I'll just say our nature is to say something that we may think may work. And that's okay if you kind of put it in that context. But I like to say, well, I don't have the answer to that, but I'll find someone who does, or I'll do some research and get back to you. That's about being respected. Don't just say something that you like, cross your fingers and hope you're right. That's not going to play well, and you won't have the respect to do that. People will respect you if you say at times you don't know, if you honestly don't know. Something that's hard to do for some of us, but it's something that's important. So on another very practical note, how to make PowerPoint presentations. This is something that I've done hundreds and hundreds of presentations. And to my knowledge, I have never once did an exact same presentation, ever. I always try to craft it to the audience. That doesn't mean that 95% of it isn't the same, but still something to connect with that audience is important. So one of the things I'm going to say, and again, this has to do with the use of text. Minimize the use of text. Now that does depend who you are. If you're a researcher, you're probably going to have to throw up research and data and so forth. But if you're using text, please use a big enough font. And I typically use 44 point for titles, like that's what you see in the top of this slide there now. And a 24 font is a minimum. The font I have right here for my bullet points is, I believe it's 36. Now there are times that there's exceptions to that, and sometimes it's better to make 2 slides and not cram everything on one. So I want to show you here exactly how this looks. This is just what I said. This is a 44 point font for title slide, the title of a slide. And there you see the 36 point for the bullet points. That's very typical. If I would change that to smaller, can you feel the difference there? Even looking at your computer today, it's probably not as dramatic as if we'd be looking at a screen. So that's a 16 point for the bullet points. And it's just not there. I just flick back here and you can see the difference. It just right away, your attention is there and it's much more meaningful. The other thing that I have is about the use of pictures. So you want to maximize them. I think you all know that. And video, if you can, that's always helpful, keeps people awake. One of the problems of a webinar though, is for some people have slower internet connections, videos just don't work. They're not smooth or they just don't work. So even today, I'm limiting the use of video because of that. When I'm doing a live presentation, I maximize use of video. So that's just a little nuance you need to understand. Now here's a pet peeve that I have with the use of pictures. I would say more than 50% of people don't take time to crop their pictures or to take unnecessary parts of that picture out. That really annoys me. And I just want to show you this picture here. Now, when you look at this picture, other than it's pretty, one of my fields, by the way, that's like, okay, that's fine. That doesn't look too bad. But right away, I see a problem. There's too much sky. To me, that's just wasted time. And I learned a little trick is when you put up pictures, you just want to have enough sky to not be normally more than 10% of your picture. That gives reference. If I would draw this down and crop it down, there'd be no sky, it wouldn't be as good because it gives you a point of reference. These are subtle things that can make a difference. I'm just going to show you a crop picture. This very same picture. I took most of the sky out. I pulled it back in. It's further across my screen. Isn't that much better when you see it that versus you back up and see it there? Can you notice that difference? It's just like it's like I'm there, especially for a pretty picture like this here. So it's easy to crop pictures now. So just take a little extra seconds and do it. You can do this in literally like 10 seconds. So that's something that'll really make your presentations much, much nicer. Okay, enough with some of the technical details of the actual speaking. Now let's shift here to how to communicate cover crop fundamentals. You're going to start seeing a few things that I shared yesterday, but I'm going to share them in the context of trying to make a point here. Cover cropping is a simple concept, but it's very complex to be successful. It's really only a tool, and success is based on management. So, having said this, I've been using this slide for probably 10 years now because I know this plays well. When you're doing public speaking and you do it often enough, you can gauge minute by minute the audience, how well they're connecting with you. This is one of my slides that always connects well. I can feel it. So be aware of that when you put out the different slides. I'm also going to, I guess you'd say, correct myself here a little bit. I'm just noticing right now that I didn't space this out right over there. See, the O is off on the left, only a tool. And I think that may be because I'm running off a thumb drive here, and I created this on my desktop. So I'm really talking to myself here. I should have went through this presentation and picked that out there. I think there's something skewed when that happened. So hey, I've done this for a while and I still don't have it all down, but I do hope I'm helpful for you today here. So again, another slide that has really worked well, and I'd encourage you to use this, this concept when you're talking to people about cover cropping, about how our soils were formed by multiple species and have living roots at all times. I explained all this yesterday. I'm not going to go back over. I'm just saying, find those nuggets, those sayings, those sound bites, if you will, that play well, because this is powerful. And I have a supporting picture to back it up. And when you do that, make sure you darken that picture enough that you can actually see the you know, what the words are. Now again, you saw this slide yesterday, but this is powerful because you just can't throw on cover crops and expect miracles. So most passionate speakers, and I would say farmers are guilty of this probably more than other people because they just haven't been trained in communicating via PowerPoints and just even communication. When you kind of say, okay, cover crops are great, rah, 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 cover crops, but you can't expect miracles. So there's a design in speaking where you kind of say something positive and then you kind of say something, it's not negative, but it's a reality check. That makes you a more credible speaker. So just by putting this slide up, people don't think about it, but when you say how great cover crops are on it, then you back up and say, well, you know, they're great, but you can't expect miracles. It gives you credibility because now you're talking straight with people. And I really cringe sometimes when I see some very passionate speaker get up there. Even though everything they say may be true, it really is coming across of, I don't believe half the thing you say now because you're just putting a positive spin on it. You're not telling me any of the realities of it. So that's what I'm referring to there. This is another powerful concept in the fundamentals of cover cropping. And, you know, we're going to be talking about, you know, why cover crops don't work and things like that. You answer this question, what are you trying to accomplish? Put that question out there in their cover crops. It causes people to think. Because if people are just buying the seed because they're getting paid to do it, which is fine, but a lot of times they're just doing it for the money, if you will, they may not see the results that other people are hearing about. So for some, it might be water erosion. I give a second choice here. Maybe you're growing cover crops for forage or just to keep the ground covered, whatever, providing a few options on that. So another one here is, what's the most important cover crop tool? And this is just an example here of, I put down a shovel. It makes you think. I feel that in cover cropping, you need to have a shovel. And I made statements already that if your if your crop consultant doesn't have a shovel in their pickup truck, you should fire them. Now right there, that's a far out statement, but it's designed to make a point, because we want to see what's going on underground, and that's really important. And again, we talked about this a lot yesterday, our mindset going in. What is our mindset? This is huge. That's why I wrote the book, The Future Proof Farm, Changing Mindsets in a Changing World. That's why I spent a lot of time on that yesterday. So your attitude, your aptitude, open-mindedness, your willingness to strategically try a new concept. That bottom point there is the key point of this slide here to get farmers to thinking. Use that shovel. When you get out in the field, dig it around, see what the roots look like. It's something that you have to do. You have to know what to look for too. Can you find and identify mycorrhizal fungi on a like a cereal rye root or sorghum sudan root? Those are things that are really cool to point out to people because you can literally see how that works, and then you can have an opportunity to explain it. So this is more so when you're out in the field, in a field day or so forth. So let's address some of the other issues. Why don't farmers use cover crops? Or when they say cover crops won't work around here. I've had people come up to me even after I give a talk, and they'll say, well, Steve, that's nice. That works where you're at. You have a better climate, and you name it. And they'll say, cover crops don't work at my farm. And usually I like to get their attention. I'll say, yeah, you're right. I believe you that they don't work at your farm. Well, right away, they're not expecting that from me. And, I can be a little subtle sometimes. It's kind of my personality, but it adds to the conversation. And almost without exception, I have taken those pronouncements that cover crops won't work, and I've turned it into a nugget of hope that they can maybe try something to maybe see if they will work on their farm. So looking at some of the root causes, and this is just important for you to understand, but particularly with cover crops, of course, we got the habit or generational or what you're comfortable with. That's just a reality in the background for a lot of farmers. Crop insurance. Now we're talking something very tangible here, because crop insurance is becoming more friendly to cover crops, but it has been a barrier. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I'm just saying that. Cash crop subsidies. I'm listing that as a challenge or a barrier, because if farmers, this is tied into crop insurance, but if there's subsidies out there, whatever form that takes, why bother growing cover crops? I have a safety net. I don't need there's not a big incentive to get my soil more resilient so it weathers the extremes. And the other thing too that I think is important for those of us who influence others to know is farmers don't like being told that what they're doing has been wrong. None of us do. So how you address that is very important. How you come across is very important. I'm a believer that subsidies tend to reward poor stewardship of the land. It's a personal thing for me. I'm not saying that subsidies should be totally pulled out, but I think they've been way overused, and it hurts the use of cover crops and so forth. Rented land, that is a big one, because why would you rent land and invest cover crops if you knew that your neighbor in 4 years might offer $50 an acre more because he realizes there's more value, there's more resiliency there. That's a barrier, and it'd be another whole topic. I have a whole topic on that of how to work with landlords and so forth. Educate your landlords and talk to them about the value of cover crops. Maybe they're willing to help you in covering some of the costs, the initial costs of cover crops. This is just some of the ideas that are out there, but recognize that rented land is a huge barrier. But peer pressure is another huge one. We're human beings. What will the neighbors think? We're going to talk about that in a second. But the realities of peer pressure, it comes in different forms. Farmers do have a lot of choices that kind of fall in this category. Getting an off-farm job. There's quite a few farmers who have a secondary source of income just to bring stability. A lot of times it's just to get health insurance coverage. Putting up another chicken house or a hog barn. These are some things that farmers have done. I'm not against these. I'm just putting it out there as realities. The other thing too, that cover crops can be put in the category of, it's just another promising snake oil product. We all know what snake oil is. It's just something that someone thinks has almost magical powers or cures or whatever, and some people will put cover crops in that category. But peer pressure is hard to overcome. It's hard to be different for most of us. There are some of us who that's not a problem. You want to be different and you don't care what people think. And that's okay too. But the fear of failure is probably, again, one of the biggest components of this. And we just say, that's why I have my 10% cover crop challenge. I'm going to bring that up again today. Try something on 10%. I've talked people down when I was selling cover crop seeds. They would say, well, I've listened to you talk. I've read a lot. I've watched a bunch of YouTube videos. I'm going to plant the whole farm in cover crops next year. That's not good unless you've really done your homework. And I would say have a mentor who can help you through some of that. So the fear of failure is a reality that you need to understand when you're communicating with people. So how do we get off the right foot? How do we not have that failure? How do we lower the risk? Well, everyone has challenges. We're farmers. It's part of life. You got to be a compulsive learner. This whole thing in cover cropping and so forth is definitely something that is it's beyond just buying a bag of cover crop seed. I've said that several times, but I want to really pound that in. You need to learn. You need to continue to learn. I'm continuing to learn. I like to say, get inspired by the cheerleaders, those who are passionate and about using cover crops and soil health tactics. But follow the mentors, the people who are more that are practicing or doing what you want to accomplish. And those of you who are in the consulting realm, you work with a lot of different types of farmers, and I think the key is to ask farmers really, really upfront in your conversation, what do they want to accomplish? And then take them from wherever they're at. See, I'm not so concerned where a farmer's at. I'm more concerned about where they're headed. And if the farmer says, this is what I want to do, then you go and try to come alongside them and do that. Now here's a section here that's more specifically geared to farmers. How do you talk to your neighbors about cover crops and still remain friends? That's a reality because even at the coffee shop or just, neighbors meet sometimes at the property line for a reason, or your friends or whatever, how do you talk about these type of things? And I think it's important to consider that some will go at it and always lose friendships by doing this in not the appropriate way. So this is just a picture of my neighbors. This is taken from my farm, and it's kind of interesting. On the left, we have one neighbor who's like, no way, they're never going to plant cover crops. They're still using tillage. But the second generation has already approached me on 2 occasions. They said when they get to take over the farm, they want to talk to me. So the current generation, probably not going to happen. Then we have one in the middle there that's in the distance. He's thinking about it. Matter of fact, 2 years ago, I was surprised that I got a phone call from him and had some questions about cover crops. The one on the right-hand side, totally committed. They've been committed to cover crops for probably 15, 20 years. So there's 3 different types right in my neighborhood there. I'm not the type of person to go down and visit my neighbor there on the left and just, tell him about the values of cover crops. If he wants to ask me a question, he knows who to call. I value my friendship with my neighbor over being right, so to speak. Remember I said it's more important to be respected than being right. This is an example of that. Now, I'm sharing you my perspective on that. It's kind of how I'm wired. Apply it to your own life and how you communicate with people. I'm suggesting you're going to get more here from being available and being respected, the go-to source when questions come up. So I don't think you thought you were going to get a psychology lesson today, but what's the psychology of talking about cover crops? So I've alluded to some of these things, but I kind of want to wrap them up from a different way. Are they receptive or not? And sometimes you don't know until they ask or they bring it up. So that's again one kind of benchmark. Also be yourself. And for most of us, that's not hard to do. But sometimes I've seen people kind of get out of themselves, so to speak, and to try to make a point or something. Look for shared agreement. Um, are cover crops a good thing to control soil erosion? I think everybody's going to agree to that. Where it gets tricky is when you get into details, particularly like, do they pay, which is some of the realities. So look for that shared agreement and ask what they're trying to accomplish. What problem are they trying to solve? See it as a long-term conversation. You don't have to come to a conclusion. You'll probably be seeing, if it's your neighbors or people you connect with, you'll probably be seeing them again, and there's only so much you can do in a certain amount of time. Now, I brought it up a couple times, but do cover crops pay? It is still the number one question that most farmers ask that haven't been using them. My story is I asked this question in 1995 when I was speaking in Maryland, and I asked the question. I was talking about no-till. It was my topic. That's pretty much all I talked about in those days. I asked the question, if you no-till for 10 or more years, do cover crops pay? And had Dr. Ray Weil in the audience. He was another speaker at that meeting. He's from the University of Maryland. Come up to me afterwards and said, I'm asking the same question. Do you want to do some research in your farm? I was very honored to start that relationship. We were 4 years into it. It wasn't until 1999 where we had a dry year, and where I had cover crops planted the previous 4 years in those plots, we had a 28 bushel yield increase because 99 was a dry year. So I saw the value of cover crops. I've never asked that question since. But still to this day, farmers each have to see this on their own farm usually, or if they're convinced by, talking to others and so forth. So you as the influencer, as the neighbor, as the farmer, need to have an answer to this question. This is the stuff you can think about when you're in a tractor or when you're driving down the road. What's your answer to the question, do cover crops pay? And there's a lot of things we can kind of, some suggestions here we can use. And depending who it is, I mean, acknowledge that it's a tough question. And the whole point of that is to say, not to say, well, of course they pay. They pay. People are using them all around the world. Okay, true, but probably not going to be effective. So talk about the investment in your soil. This really plays well for absentee landowners or landlords that aren't there that are actually renting out, because it is their investment. And there's no question that it's a better investment in their soil. I always flip it back. This isn't the first thing in the conversation. I flip it back and say, well, do cash crops always pay? This is now where you get farmers to kind of realize, well, there are years where they don't, if they're honest. In most cases, that's true. But we go right back in them and do them again next year. So I like to also push a little bit further. If they're a conventional farmer and they're using traits like in corn or soybeans, do those traits always pay? And I think an honest farmer would say, well, not always, but we use them because we feel that they do. We've seen it do, but they don't always pay. The other thing too is, where's the future going, or what's the cost of potential regulations? And I know this is what really drove me in the 1980s when the Chesapeake Bay awareness was. I talked about this yesterday. Is if we don't do something, we're probably going to be regulated, and we don't like regulation, so I better do something. I don't like that as the best reason for you to use cover crops, but it is a reality out there for a lot of farmers. So continuing on, if cover crops pay, here's some of the things that you can ask. These are very open-ended questions, but what is the value of topsoil? What's the value of organic matter? What about herbicide-resistant weed control? We're going to talk about that on Friday a little bit. There's value there. There's a lot of people, I'm just telling you right now, who have got into cover crops because they're seeing some benefits to help control herbicide-resistant weeds. So there's something there. That's getting people's attention. What about nutrient retention? Keeping it on your fields, on your farm. Or increased nitrogen production with legumes, or increased availability of nutrients just because of a healthier soil. I'll just mention really quickly the background picture you see there of the people around It's in one of my pumpkin fields. It was one of the companies that I work with for pumpkins and squash. And they were in at another farm. It was a rainy day and they were out evaluating the varieties that they were testing. And they called me and they said, we're like literally stuck in the mud. I know you no-till, can we come to your fields? And I had gotten rain as well. And when they showed up, it was really interesting because the one guy, it was the first time he ever saw no-till pumpkins. And man, was he ever raving about it. No mud at all on his shoes. It had just rained. So that was just a tangible time that they saw it for themselves, you know, the difference, and it really made their job a lot easier. Again, here, do cover crops pay? What would you like to accomplish? Man, that's the first question I always ask. And then to stress that management is key. I harped on that yesterday. I brought that up many times because that really is the difference. And then start with the easiest method. I used to say when I was back selling cover crops and the tillage radish that tillage radish is like a cover crop with training wheels. Hard to screw it up. It grows easy. If winter kills, you don't have to worry about it. At least in most northern climates, it winter kills. You don't have to worry about it in the spring. Cereal rye is another category where it's well known, there's a lot of information out of it, not hard to grow, not hard to terminate generally. So start with the easiest methods. And you know, it's kind of rare you find someone that wants to start out with a 12-way mix of cover crops. They can do that if they have someone that's giving them good advice, but you don't want to push people there if they're not ready for that. So this whole message of treating cover crops like cash crops, remember I said I keep certain slides in. This slide has probably been in my deck for like almost 20 years now. It's just so effective. It's about the mindset, helping farmers understand that. But more recently, I'm using this slide as a follow-up. The profit is in the management, and this plays into the do cover crops pay. And this is the exact same thing, though, that farmers get out of their cash crops. It's just they don't think about it with their cover crops. It's a mindset issue. So these two slides go together. Treat your cover crops like your cash crops, but then the subsequent is the profit is in the management. It's very important concepts to get across. So what are some more talking points? I've been talking about the fundamentals and so forth and everything, but what are some of the talking points that we can share once we get that opportunity, either from in the speaking time or just one-on-one with your clients or your neighbors, whatever? One of the things that I've heard about is it's easy to understand that green living covers help filter the water as it moves through the soil and eventually to our streams. Lisa's going to talk about this later on. That's an easy concept to understand, and most people get that. The other thing about the soil life and how it recycles nutrients, again, not going to expound on that, but just use that as examples out there to help people. Now, again, here we're flipping the conversation. When you have crusting, poor infiltration, or erosion, how many times do you hear farmers blaming the plow or blaming tillage? Probably never. But every time there's a problem with cover crops or no-till, they're blaming the concept, the no-till, or it's the cover crops. So again, it's just to cause people to think. Hopefully, in years down the road, people won't be blaming no-till and cover crop. It's becoming more mainstream. But I'm just giving you points here to think about as you communicate. Little story, I was in Bulgaria a couple years ago, and this was their attempt to do some no-till. And I must say it wasn't too bad, but they wanted to compare no-till versus conventional tillage, as you can see here. And I don't know how this field turned out. It was just planted like within days before I was there. They had no row cleaners on their planter, which may not have been necessary. But that being said, it was a good attempt for what they knew. Now I was on another farm with, and I had never seen this before. And I really appreciated the farmer's sincerity. He really wanted to make no-till work, but he literally was using an old shoe type planter. I'm talking like 1950s. Remember the shoe before they had double discs? And it doesn't look no-till here, but to make this work, he had his little tine in front that was kind of working up the soil a little bit. But I literally took this picture. He had planted his field a couple days before, and like a third of the seeds I could see. It wasn't even closing the slot. And he just didn't know a whole lot. And he said, that's just not going to work. I said, no, it's not going to work. And I explained to him he needs to get a newer planter. It's just, there's no way he can make his planter work. I told him, you can't make that planter work. So it's just some of those, sometimes you have to not make fun of people, but go back to where they're at. I appreciated his heart. I appreciated his sincerity. And again, the way it looked in that farm, not a lot of money. So, he was trying. So you got to give him credit for that. Another important dynamic that you need to remember is planting at the ideal time. This is a picture of me watching the corn silage chopper as I'm planting cover crops. We're literally 30 seconds behind the chopper. The point here is I'm demonstrating how this can be done. Planting at the ideal time. Every day counts with cover crops. And this falls into the category of treating your cover crops like your cash crops. Because we always try to plant our cash crops on time, right? Well, if you do this, you maximize the growing degree days and the days that you have, because it makes a difference. Now, here's another scenario. This was on my farm. We got rained out. On the left-hand side was, well, I should start on the right-hand side was September the 29th planting date. On the left was October the 7th. This picture was taken in November. A huge difference, just 8 days made in that time period. So timeliness is very, very important to get this done. Another thing about troubleshooting. We always have issues that come up and you want to be helpful. Again, understanding the dynamics of cover crops is important. Try to identify what the primary cause of the issue is. How can you address the cause? It's typical, but again, just understanding that there's a lot of tools out there now in cover cropping. I like to show this picture because farmers get it. It's kind of cool. Some of our tractor cabs are loaded up with all this. These are just tools here, and we have a use for each of them. Same way with our planters. They're tools, and for cover crops, you got to get the right ones. Sometimes they may require quite a bit of investment. Other times they don't. So how much are you investing in learning about the tools of the trade for cover cropping? Going to meetings, field days, self-education, just coming back to that. This is not something that you just learn overnight. It's literally a lifetime of experience. And you want to have a working knowledge of how cover crops can benefit the soil, how they affect the biology, how you can make fertilizer more efficient, which that always ties into profit. All these basics and learning that is very important. Now, looking at specific planters here, this is a close-up of a planter that has a row cleaner on. You can see it was a little wet when we were planting there. But how do you adjust these settings? Not going to talk a lot about that today, but I literally had a person who just got a job with a company. I forget if they're selling cover crop seeds, but they were kind of new to agriculture. They wanted to come over to my place and just have me show them the basic components of a no-till planter. And I appreciated that, their tenacity to learn the tools of the trade. So sometimes you run into challenges that are easy fix. Right here, I was planting, this is my planter, I was planting in about 18-inch tall mix of hairy vetch and triticale. And I thought I'm not gonna bother rolling, it wasn't quite tall enough, but we were getting quite a bit of the hairy vetch catching on the planter. And trust me, that can happen. But it was the easiest fix. I just got some rope and pulled it across the front, and it laid down that cover crop enough that it solved my problem. It wasn't catching back here. That was just a simple solution, a simple challenge. Just showing that sometimes it doesn't have to be expensive. There are other things that can get very frustrating. If you use some of these spoke type closing wheels, as you see here, they can literally wrap the cover crops. And you may have to go back to the shop, get your air tools out and take everything off and clean this out. Not a good situation. Definitely not a happy farmer. And if you recommended cover crops and this happens, you might get a phone call and asking how to remedy it. Well, you could blame the cover crops. or you could solve the problem. There are deflectors here that you can put in there, and I have a couple different sets from a couple different companies that I've used to basically solve that problem. So there may be a solution out there that's very easy fix. I mentioned about needing a mentor. This is Frederic Thomas. He's a farmer friend from France. He's been to my farm. We talk about once a month. Yeah, we're continents apart, but kind of similar in our growing areas. But you know, he has some ideas that I've benefited from, and I think it's vice versa. And I've been over there 4 times, and so he's one of my mentors. I have quite a few. I think you should too. It's just very important to do this. So this is how the long-term adoption of cover crops can occur, and how we can be effective in that. Always learning, always curious. Showing beats telling. And if whatever you can show people, that's why we have field days. And who are your cover crop champions? Those you influence. Who are they? Identify them. Spend the majority of your time with these people. There's a concept out there called whisper to the influencers, then let them amplify your message, I should say there. And that's very credible when you're able to do that. Farmers will respond to farmers. So that's key. If you're a consultant, and if you know a farmer is willing to share their ideas, or maybe willing to take a phone call from another neighbor, if you can be the bridge to put that together, it'll make you look good, and you'll be helping for this cause here. I just got to say here that this is a friend of mine, Lloyd. I know you were on yesterday. I don't know if you're on today. I didn't check, but I got you in here, Lloyd. So I thought you'd like that. So moving on, again, factors influencing cover crop adoption. It's been a grassroots movement, and some of the challenges, there's millions of dollars behind biotech and biological products now that are coming of age. And you know, I'm not a big fan of large corporations, but you know, it's starting to come around. We have a compelling green story to share. So, you know, as I wind up here, just, you know, learn all you can and understand where the future is going. I mentioned this yesterday. This was actually a cover of the Successful Farming magazine several years ago. And I like the tagline at the top there. There was another story in here about why it's critical that farmers invest in soil health, is because, you know, this is a millennial shopper depicted here. Whether you like it or not, they do have an influence on what you do. And it's something we need to pay attention for. So there's 2 more quick things I want to finish up with here. One of them is about a successful field day and how you do that. You can have a good field day, you can have a so-so field day. So if anything is more than, you know, 50 or so people, I got listed here a bunch of things that you need to think about and do, and to make it a really, really nice field day where people come and they can maximize their learning opportunities. Identify who your target audience is. Is it farmers, educators, general public, others? Sometimes you might have legislators there, or all of these. Just want to know who that is, and try to time the year, the time of the year when you can synchronize that with what you're trying to showcase, trying to accomplish. You might have demonstration plots. And also, if you have kind of a bigger one, more than 50 people or so, you might want to establish a point person for that event. Another little thing is naming the field day. You just look at the difference there. You know, you could have Steve Grawl's field day or your field day versus making cover crops pay. You know, have a field day title that's clever enough that makes people want to ask questions and look for more. Having demos there, like a rainfall simulator, never gets old. I've seen dozens of them. And try to collaborate with other people, with university, NRCS, private groups. That always helps to increase the interest. It is a little thing, but have good parking. I pulled into field days where I didn't know where to park. And some things that you tend not to think about. Another thing is, do you have a backup plan in case of bad weather? This is one of my field days. It rained 1.1 inches during the field day. It was a little smeary, but it worked out. And some people said it was a great field day because they got to see the farm in a rain event. So another thing, we got a helicopter in one year, which was really cool. I remember when the helicopter came in to circle, I overheard someone say, and I don't think they knew I was there, they said, wow, this is like the real deal. And it kind of made me feel good to do that. It's not always easy to do that, but it sure has a lot of attention. And just wrapping up, how to get grants for field days. It's just something that you need to know a little bit about. You need to do your homework. I would suggest you talk to people who have been successful in that. And this is where your universities, your maybe even your NRCS people and other groups, they got a handle on this. I've done a lot with Stroud Water Research, which is helping here, and Jen, who's on here with Resource Smart. Together, we've pulled off some pretty nice grants to be able to do this. So when you have that small group discussion, this is just some of the things that is pretty straightforward, but it's more difficult than it seems, because you can have some people that dominate the conversation, other people don't say anything. I think that's the most important thing to draw out of people, and to be able to get everybody that they want to be heard. That's the goal that you want to have by the end of the meeting. So I'm just gonna, sum this all up by saying, encourage people that 10% cover crop challenge. It's not too much that it scares them, but it's enough that they can actually make a difference. So however you can, spin that when you're talking, I think is important. So that just brings me to a close. I'll mention the book I wrote. You can see it there, stevegroff.com if you're interested. So Jen, I'm going to turn it back to you, and let me know if we go some questions now or go right into Lisa.
I think we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to let Lamont jump in because I think we're going to do a poll. So I'll let him introduce that. And then while everybody's answering, maybe that's a good time to get to some of the questions that we have.
Great.
Lamont, do you want me to stop sharing?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Either way. So we're going to launch a poll here because we would really like to find out where you are coming from, all of you that are on the call. So again, as Jen mentioned, this is anonymous, and it'll just give us all a sense of where our group is coming from today. So I'm going to launch this, and please fill it out. Just give you a minute or so.
So Steve, the first one that I'm going to start with was kind of a clarifying question from your presentation. Are cover crops a contributor to the spread of herbicide-resistant weeds?
Not to my knowledge. I do know, I'll just mention that the one that comes to mind is annual ryegrass has, I'll say, been accused of being herbicide resistance. That could be, but generally there's other factors involved there. It is simply hard to kill, I'll admit. But so I would say the answer is generally not.
Okay. Let's see. We've got one question about whether or not there's a cover crop program in Pennsylvania. I'm going to suggest maybe we kind of take that and answer that on the side or offline here. Another question that we had was about slugs. Mm-hmm. So, a big challenge. So do cover crops cause slugs, true or false? And how to control them on natural or organic land?
My answer is yes. So do cover crops encourage slugs? Yes. I'm going to break this down a little bit here. Does no-till encourage slugs? Yes. But let's go back and look at trying to identify the reason for that and what we can do about that, because this has been an issue. What I am finding out, and there's a lot of other, I'm going to say veteran cover croppers, no-tillers are finding out, is that when we start diversifying our crops a little more, having more small grains in the mix, and providing, I'll say, habitat, or providing just the opportunity for beneficial insects to come in and help to, we'll just say, eat the slugs. That is kind of what we're looking at. And this is falls under the category of trying to mimic nature. And it probably requires a 15-minute discussion to explain everything. We are definitely seeing the use of neonicotinoid insecticides is having what we call a non-target secondary effect on slugs, because those insecticides are killing the beneficials that can't take out the slugs naturally. So I can't explain all that now. It'd take way too much time, but it's all about the system. That's why I keep saying it's about the system. I am not going to tell you that you can eliminate slugs. I am telling you you can manage them. And there are some years where it's worse than others. I think we all know that. So, when you just plant corn and soybeans, you're basically setting yourself up to have slug problems, even if you just add a cover crop, because it's pretty much the same time of year in the spring when they grow and everything. So my short answer is slugs can be managed in what I'll call a regenerative agriculture system. Now, there is a few strategies we can use. There's some slug baits out there that are somewhat effective, and a few other methods like spraying on liquid nitrogen at night when they're out. There's a few little tricks, I guess you'd say, to do that. But I always like to try to go, how can we cure the problem rather than just put a Band-Aid on it? And for me, a Band-Aid would be tillage. Okay. So that's a little bit where I'm coming from, what I've experienced on my own farm. I have slugs on my farm. Have they been a problem? Not generally. I think it was the 2017 was a bad slug year for everyone, from the Midwest all the way up through the whole Mid-Atlantic. And they haven't been bad since. And we don't really know why, because we've had sort of similar weather sometimes. So that's my quick answer on that, Jen.
Yeah, that's hard to have a quick answer. So thank you. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to encourage everybody to keep asking your good questions in the Q&A box. And also, if everyone else can go through and kind of check through them periodically, there's a little thumbs up icon there. And that's how, if you click on those, they'll rise to the top so that we can make sure that we address everyone's kind of most prominent questions throughout the webinar. So I'm going to check in with Lamont on the poll.
Yeah, thanks, Jen.
Doing there? Yep.
Yep. Let me show you the results. So a couple interesting things here, folks. We have every single state that's in the Chesapeake Bay watershed represented by you all out in the audience. So that's one interesting thing. And you can just scroll down if you need to get to the bottom, because another thing that's interesting here is that about 10% of our audience today comes from another country. I wish we could have a 20 answer poll so we could find out what countries we're actually talking about. But thank you all for joining us today.
Pennsylvania wins, I see.
Yes, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jen, could I just say one other thing? Because a question came up about getting resources, getting funding for cover crop field days and small research trials. And Lisa, you'll be hearing from her in just a minute or so, but Lisa and I serve on this Pennsylvania chapter of the Soil and Water Conservation Society. And one of our programs is to offer small grants to farmers and conservation districts and extension, whoever is the local group there in a county in Pennsylvania, to financially support a cover crop or soil health investigation of some kind. So go to our website, Keystone Soil and Water Conservation Society, just Google that and you can see how to apply for those small grants. Very easy process. Okay, great. Thanks.
That's awesome. Okay, so we are going to turn it over to Lisa Blazer now from the Stroud Water Research Center with her presentation about where the water goes. Where's the water going? I'm sorry.
That's all right. Close enough. All right. Let me start from the beginning. Hold on a second here, guys.
And Lisa, would you just be able to introduce yourself? Because we haven't really built in formal introductions in this.
Yeah, absolutely. So welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be part of today's event and following up and hopefully reinforcing a lot of what Steve just said. So I'm, as already mentioned, Lisa Blazier. I work for Stroud Water Research Center with Lamont, and I'm serving as the soil health coordinator, and also serving in that coordinator role for a newly established Pennsylvania Soil Health Coalition. But prior to my time at Stroud, I worked for my county conservation district for almost 12 years. So I've had a lot of these one-on-one conversations with farmers, given a lot of presentations, put on those field days. So I think the message and the topic that we're talking about today about communication is really critical for helping to spread this message. So Stroud Water Research Center, we've been around for about 50 years, a little over 50 years, and we're focused on stream health and the factors that influence stream health. And we've now, in about the last 10 years, broadened that approach beyond the stream corridor now to working in the watershed, and primarily with farmers in the watershed as those land managers. Because we know if we want healthy stream systems, it's directly correlated with healthy watersheds and the way those lands are being managed. So we've had great partnerships with Steve, with the Pennsylvania No-Till Alliance, and really broadening out into agricultural management. You know, so Steve talked a lot already about your mindset. And this could be us as conservation professionals and advisors, our mindset going into something. And what does it take to change a grower, a farmer's mindset, to get him to adopt some of these practices that we're promoting? You know, and we can be effective communicators. We can implement all those tips that Steve just gave us. We can put on field days, but we're always going to have those guys that are kind of on the fence and a little hesitant, you know. So what does it take sometimes for those guys to switch perspectives? And a lot of times it's going to be those drought years, you know, and farmers occasionally, they need that aha kind of moment, you know, they need that kind of jolt to the system. And that happens during these drought years when they're seeing stressed crops. They know their yields are going to be impacted. They know their bottom lines are going to be impacted. And perhaps they're driving around and seeing some of their neighbors' farms that the corn's not as curled, they're not as stressed, the crops aren't as stressed. And they know how those neighbor farms are being managed. And if those neighbor farms have been continuous no-till and cover cropping and implementing some of these practices, those drought years are sometimes a really good evidence on comparing farm to farm, and where they're at with their soils and their management with their soils. You know, and it's all about that moisture management when we do get those rains, you know. And then the opposite can also be true, all right? We've had years where we've gotten tons of rain, and we're starting to see more of those shifts in precipitation. So the same thing can be true on years when it's really wet, and driving around the neighborhoods to see how those different fields are behaving differently based on management, you know. And a great thing to do, you know, Steve talked about building relationships with the farmers, you know, and pictures say 1,000 words in a presentation, and seeing something live in person with your eyes also says 1,000 words. So on a good rainy day, good heavy rain, you know, if you've got the relationship with a farmer, call him up, because you know he's not going to be busy with field work on a day like that, and say, hey, what are you doing? You know, you want to go take a ride with me? And drive the area, you know, and look to see how water is moving across that landscape, what fields we got water running off of, what's the color of that water. And then this can even be done the day after. So this slide, I think, is a great illustration. It was taken by farmer friend I'm in North Central Pennsylvania. And he's one of those guys that he drives his fields on the rainy days because he wants to see how that water's coming off his field. So these are two of his pictures. He stood right on the paved road, right where that yellow star is on the map, turned to the farm on the left-hand side of the screen, shot that picture, and then turned 180 degrees to the other side of the road and took a picture of his fields. And this is just a great illustration. We've got same soil types, we've got same position in the landscape. The main difference with these two farms is how they're managed. The farm on the left has been conventional tillage with tobacco, corn, occasional cover crops, but not real regular, versus Jim's fields with 40 years no-till and 20 years cover crop. So it's really the management of these soils. So what is it about these soils that are allowing that infiltration? And it's all about that soil structure, right? It's about creating conditions that create this pore space to create those voids and allow that water to soak down when it rains. But then also importantly, we need that air space. We need that good soil structure to allow oxygen to get down into the root system. And we need the soils to breathe off that carbon dioxide as these residues are breaking down and the microbes are respiring. We need carbon dioxide to leave the soils and get up into that plant canopy to cycle. So I come at this question of soil structure from this conservation perspective, right? You know, I'm concerned with soil erosion in the fields, and hopefully the farmers are as well. But I'm concerned with water runoff and water leaving those fields, taking the soil with it, carrying the water, the potential pollutants, and creating these flashy systems in our streams when we get those localized rains. So I'm encouraging you, though, even though I'm coming at it of promoting these practices to build soil structure from that perspective, it's important when you're talking with a farmer to frame the conversation as to what is important to them, what resonates with them, and why do they care about soil structure. And soil structure, primarily from a farm perspective, is he doesn't want to rut up his fields and create compaction issues. So when you've got good soil structure, it's able to support the weight of that equipment better, and you're not going to get the rutting, you're not going to get stuck, and you're perhaps going to be able to get into that field a couple days quicker than what your neighbors are. You know, so Steve earlier posed that question, you know, you want to have an answer, do cover crops pay? And he threw out a lot of great examples there. But one way that cover crops pay, you know, if somebody asks you that, you say, well, what's the value of you being able to get into the field 2 days sooner to take advantage of those good planting conditions or the good harvest conditions? You know, that's a huge value of cover crops, is being able to get into these fields quicker after we get those heavy rains. And then the other thing that's real obvious and visible to farm and walk in the fields is this crusting condition that forms. So this picture up in the top corner with the corn, when we don't have crop residue, when we've got conventional tillage type management, that soil is very vulnerable. We get that crusting. We're not only preventing water from infiltrating when it rains, we're preventing that air exchange, that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in the soil when we get that crusting. And I don't know if you guys can see, but do you see the little white urea pellets that are on the surface? So this farmer's side dress spent a lot of money on urea, and it's just laying on the surface. And what's going to happen if we get a heavy rain immediately on this field? And that's just wasted money. So soil structure and building that soil organic matter goes hand in hand with that, because remember that organic matter serves as the sponge. So not only do we want that water infiltrating, we want that organic matter to act as the sponge, keep the water in that soil profile, and be crop available to the roots. So what's it going to take to build this soil structure? And it's aggregates. And the only way that you're going to be able to judge soil structure on the farm is to dig a shovel. So I completely echo what Steve said. You've got to have a shovel with you in the vehicle or anytime you're out on a farm, because you got to dig a hole, look at what that soil looks like. And a good, healthy soil is going to look like cottage cheese. It's going to look like that crumbly texture. It's going to be rich in organic matter. And then we know we've got that aggregation and that pore space. And what does it take to build this aggregation? All right. And there's two key components, and that's reducing your soil disturbance, because anytime you're doing a tillage pass across those fields, you're physically breaking up that aggregation within that soil structure. And you're getting smaller and smaller striation of those particles. And the other key way that you're building soil aggregates is to feed those soil microbes, because it's really that mycorrhizae fungi system in these soils that have that hypha network that physically wrap around the soils. And also they're creating and secreting these biological glues called glomalin or glomalin. And it's these biological glues that really form these stable aggregates. So how do we feed those soil microbes? We need a living plant and that living root system. We need to have that living plant as many months out of the year as we can, which is why cover crops are so critical in this management philosophy, to capture that solar energy, the carbon dioxide, convert it to sugars, put it out through the root system as root exudates to drive that soil biology and keep this aggregation forming. So another concept that I want to just spend a little bit of time on today is this concept of effective rainfall. And I was first exposed to this through some of Alan Savory's teachings. So this is not a new concept, but it's really about how efficiently are you using the water that falls on those farm fields. So in Pennsylvania, we have about 41 inches of rainfall, precipitation, snow rainfall annually. That's going to vary depending on what state you're in and where you're at. But that rainfall really has different effectiveness depending on how the land is managed. So let me get my annotation going here. So if we're looking at this illustration on the left-hand side of the screen and taking this management system, for example, we've got a system that has had some tillage event. It has no crop residue in this system. So when these raindrops are coming down, hitting the soil, it's physically breaking up that soil structure at the surface, creating those crusting conditions. And the other key thing that's happening here, by not having that crop residue and that mulch layer, these soils are exposed to the heat of the sun and loss for evaporation. So when soil temperatures get about 95 degrees, that's the tipping point as to whether that soil moisture is going into the plant and plant growth, or it's being directly lost up into the air through evaporation. So under this type of management system, we're going to have increased runoff and increased loss of that soil moisture through evaporation. Now, when we compare that to a regenerative ag, right, a no-till cover crop system that we have here on the right, we can see it's vastly different. And we've got that residue. We're keeping that soil cool. We're reducing that evaporation. We've got better soil structure. So when it does rain, it's soaking in, it's getting down deeper. We've got some recharge, and that's being held in that root zone to then later come up the plant as transpiration, which is way that water cycle should naturally function through those plant systems. And then this graphic on the left is just reinforcing those points, you know, of how critical that soil structure is to how effectively each inch of that rainfall and precipitation is to enhancing the crops. All right, so I would encourage you to really start doing this with your farmers. You know, if you've got the time, do these water infiltration rates on the farm. It's a very, very visual tool to be able to see how that soil structure changes with management and over time. So you can use this double ring infiltration method. It's a little more accurate, a little more time consuming, and it requires more water. Or you can do a simple single ring test down at the bottom. You can make this equipment yourself, or the farmer can make it. You take a 6-inch section of pipe, you bevel the one edge so it drives down into the soil a little bit deeper. You take a known volume of water that represents an inch of water in that 6-inch ring, and you just time how long it takes to soak in. You know, so it's a real simple thing that either a farmer can do themselves or you can do out there on the farm to really illustrate that. So the picture here is a farm near me, north central Pennsylvania. And again, long-term no-till, long-term cover crop management. And this is some of the infiltration data that they've collected on the farm. So if you went into the web soil survey for this particular soil type, that saturated conductivity is predicted to be about 1.3 inches an hour. And you can see by the average results of these two tests that were done on the farm, you know, the 3-4-fold increase that this farmer is achieving with the management system that he's operating. You know, so our ag soils have this huge potential to influence the way that water flows across the landscapes of these farms. And then to illustrate the point further, we want this groundwater recharge. So not only does better soil structure keep that water in the crop root zone and directly benefit the crops, but we're getting less runoff to the streams, less flash flood kind of conditions that can really impact stream systems and change the dynamics. And we get more of that groundwater recharge system. And this is going to be especially important. There are areas in the central part of our country where those aquifers are rapidly shrinking and have been for years because we're drawing out that water for irrigation and we're not managing the land in a way that's putting that water back down into it. And then from Stroud's perspective, when we're looking at the stream influences, having this groundwater recharge system in place gets that water down into the groundwater, which eventually makes its way to the stream systems. That water is cool, that water is cleaner, and that water represents those summertime base flow conditions in our streams. So the more we can get that groundwater recharge level, it's eventually going to make its way to our surface water systems as clean, cool water and sustain those systems during those summer months as well. So there's this direct connection, right? More water infiltration equals less water runoff. So from a farm perspective, less water runoff means less risk for soil erosion. So farmers don't want to lose that precious topsoil layer. Society does not want that soil and anything associated with that soil getting into our stream systems and impacting. So we want, as we're getting these storms on these farm landscapes, to be flowing clear water like we see here on this tributary. Clean water coming off those fields and avoiding conditions that's creating the sediment-laden runoff coming from our systems. And then the last point I want to leave you with is it's important to shift your perspective sometimes. You know, as conservation professionals, you know, we've been trained to treat runoff issues. when we're working with a farm, they've got runoff issues, we often do structural practices. We'll put in a grassed waterway like you see here. You know, a lot of diversions have been put in over the years. In some cases, there's field terracing. We do a lot of structural changes to address runoff, but runoff is not the underlying problem. And I love this quote from Ray Archuleta, that we don't have a runoff problem, we have an infiltration problem. You know, so as we're having these conversations with farmers about why we want them to adopt no-till practices, adopt cover crops, diversity, all of these principles that factor into soil health and regenerative agriculture, we're getting now at the source of the problem. And the source of the problem is we've got very poor infiltration and soil structure in these farms and these ag lands. So these practices get to the source of the problem, and we need to step away and stop treating only the symptoms, and that's the runoff. You know, so I just want to leave with that point. You know, it's that shift in perspective, shift in philosophy, and all the good that cover crops and no-till and these practices can benefit the farmer. We're also going to see that benefiting the environment and benefiting society. So with that, I'll wrap it up, Jen, and hopefully we've got some time for questions. I didn't go over too much, I hope.
Well, so I'm going to encourage people to ask questions in the Q&A box. We do have a comment in there so far that says, great concept, quality rainfall versus quantity. In my area, we have termed it harvesting rainwater. So if you guys have any questions for Lisa, go ahead and enter them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And hopefully we can get to those at the end. And in the meantime, I will turn it back over to Steve. And thank you so much for the great information.
Welcome. You're on mute, Steve.
There we are. I guess you're going to ask me some of the questions, Jen or Lamont.
I'm on mute. We've got a few, but I think I'm going to let you get started and we'll come back because some of these are more technical, like management specific questions. So I want to come back to these at the end and give people a chance to enter more in.
Okay, I guess I'm a little unclear, Jen. What do you want me to do now?
Do you have a presentation for the second half, right? Or do we just have questions?
Sorry about that. I did it all at the first, if that's if I misunderstood that.
Well, super. Okay. So we'll go through some questions.
Okay, so I did. Okay, sorry about that. I guess I should have broken up my first one a little bit more.
No, that works. That works fine. We'll start into them.
No problem.
Okay, so I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. Again, you know, if you have questions in there and go ahead and give them a thumbs up if you want to vote them up so that we make sure that we get to them. So I'll start at the top of the list and work my way down. So cover crop establishment is very important. However, when we harvest in July, it's really dry. If we don't get enough rain till a maximum month before ideal planting time, is it worth trying to establish a cover crop?
Yeah, I've gotten this question before, particularly when I was in Eastern Europe, because that's pretty much where, that's one area of the country, or the world, I should say, that this occurs. My answer is, there's two approaches to this. One of them is some years there is enough leftover moisture to get a cover crop going. And if it gets germinated and is enough to get going, it'll usually survive over that normal dry period over the summer. The other is, well, put it in the ground and when it rains, it'll come up. The danger of that, though, is if you just have a small amount of rain, a few tenths or a few millimeters of rain, it's going to sprout and then it just be dry and it won't be able to, just won't be able to survive. So what I would recommend is, if there's enough moisture just to get the seed germinated that's still existing in the soil, maybe plant a little deeper to find that moisture, plant. If not, wait until expected rain is coming. And you can choose then to wait till the rain comes. Usually in that period or that time period, it's not a lot that you can plant within a day or 2 or 3, or you can try to plant beforehand and hopefully rain comes and it grows. So what I like to respond to a comment like that is be ready when be ready to make those decisions. So sometimes it's simply, is there cover crop seed available? Do you have the cover crop seed if you think you might have an opportunity? So that's the important part, because granted, there are some times in any cover cropping scenario that it's not going to grow. It's just too dry. And I like to say that's farming. That also happens sometimes in cash crops. So keep it in that perspective. But if conditions are favorable, go ahead and plant it, because I've been to Australia a couple times. One time I was in Australia, it was very dry. Another time I was there, it was very wet, I should say. And so the point is to be ready when that opportunity avails itself. And it may be a few years sometimes, but what you get accomplished, if you're ready, will hold value in the years to come to actually make your soil more drought resistant. So it's a process, and you just gonna have to work with the weather in that regard.
Sounds good. Let's see, the next one we have here. So northeast US, the biggest challenge into field corn. So getting planted early enough for enough growth pre-winter, even cereal rye, and getting more diverse cover crop species.
So that's a common problem in northern climates. And the first thing I'm going to say is consider interseeding when the corn's V3, V4, and that when it's knee high or so. And I'll quickly say that interseeding has not been as effective on longer grower season climates. In the United States, we use Interstate 80 kind of as a guide. North of Interstate 80, we will find interseeding to be effective. So what that does is you get your seeds planted, your cover crop seeds, when the corn is growing, after the corn gets a head start, and it kind of goes dormant over the summer. And then as the corn starts to dry down, the leaves start falling down, you have more sunlight reaching in there and it starts to come to life. And by the time you're harvesting, it's already there. Essentially, like you would have planted it about a month sooner, the equivalent of that. So there's a little bit of nuances to how that all works. Depending where you're at in your latitude, you might consider planting some shorter season corn to be able to get your cover crop planted in a more timely fashion in the fall. Now, granted, if you're in Canada or up north there, that's even not an option anymore. So you got to change things around a little bit. Is there other markets? Is there small grains you could potentially grow that would come off a little earlier so you get some cover crops planted? That does vary by geography. So there's been a lot of work with interseeding, and I think that is something you want to consider first to address that issue.
Okay. And you mentioned Canada there, so I think that leads nicely into our next question. Is there a correlation between healthier soil with cover crops used in areas with less frozen days versus cover crops in states where the ground stays frozen for long periods of time?
I'll give you my farmer response to that, because I'm not a soil scientist. And I'll say, as I understand, when you're frozen soil pretty much shuts down almost all the biology, most of it, I'll say. And so we've actually seen that northern soils sometimes can be brought to, increased organic matter very quickly. And it's because it's not being broken down as fast because it's not year round compared to southern soils that are never frozen. So the answer is yes, you can build them up. It's amazing, I guess, because there's a lot of growth can happen because typically those soils have a very long days in the summer and a lot of growth can occur.
Yeah. Yeah, I live in Delaware and I travel quite a bit to North Dakota, and you know, yeah, I'm not even a farmer and I'm jealous of the soils that I see when I go out that way. So
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it. North Dakota is one example where, you know, it was amazing to me how good their soils were. And yeah, they're frozen like 3 months out of the year.
let's see. So the next one we have, so the 10% cover crop challenge. Best products and goals to be targeting to allow as many of them to be successful as possible. And that particular person is from Northwest Pennsylvania.
Okay. So if you're new, some of the, I mean, we know about cereal rye. It can be literally planted almost, you know, up till Christmas, if you will. If you can even get in the ground, you won't see it, but the seeds are very tough. They will grow in the spring. Now, when it's planted that late, it's going to be delayed compared to planting earlier in the spring as well. The other thing is, it's particular if you're Northwestern Pennsylvania, you have small grains. You got plenty of time to plant like radishes. That's, like I had mentioned, is like kind of the cover crop with training wheels. So after small grains, plant some radishes. The nice thing about them is they're very easy to grow and they'll winter kill in Northwestern Pennsylvania. And you'll find a nice mellow soil to plant into in the spring. So that's kind of two of my easiest ones to get started with. And I would say too, that with cereal rye, the first year you do it, if you're a little bit timid, is to put that in fields that are going to go to soybeans. Much easier going to soybeans than it is to corn. That's another whole topic, but just suffice it to say, planting soybeans into cereal rye is a very good starting spot. So 10% of your acres, plant them into soybeans into cereal rye. That should be a pretty surefire first start. It'll be successful.
Okay. I know I said I was going to start at the top and work my way down, but I was not being honest because I've been reading through the comments and questions here, and I think a lot of them have to do with that early planting or the planting window question. But I'm going to pull this one out here. I'm having pushback from family partners on my farm for implementing no-till and cover crops. It is partially because of fear of failure. How do I talk through this with them, with this dynamic? And what are some suggestions to get the ball starting to roll?
I know how you feel. When I started this, let me just say that I did not have support from my father. It took about 10 years until he saw that there might be something to this. So it is a reality, and I understand. I would encourage your family, your partners, to maybe go to a field day, just to see and to hear. I hear of a lot of epiphanies happening at field days. To literally see it. Is there a possibility to use a field and maybe dedicate a field? And here again, to make sure everyone's happy, probably not out along the highway. Might be keep everyone a little bit happier out back somewhere, and to try some things. Try with using radishes maybe at first, or using cereal rye, some of the easy stuff. Unless you feel confident, you know, if you do have some neighbors in your geographical area that are onto some stuff, you know, play off that. What's working in your area with your soil types and planting dates, all that stuff. You know, learn all you can. And it's sometimes, you know, for instance, I indicated here, I have my next door neighbor who he's older, and I asked him if he wanted to drive a tractor for our field days when we had wagon tours. I thought, he's going to see this firsthand. He sees my farm every day, but he's going to hear it from people. And, you know, it's interesting. He gave a very positive response on that day, but did it change anything on his farm? Absolutely not. That's going to be a generational change there. So that is an extreme. But I got to tell you that for me, with my situation, my father, It took time. When I got married, I had the adjoining farm, and he gave me permission to do whatever I wanted on that because I was at that time renting it from him. Well, I remember the day he said, "You're not doing that in my farm." So I get it. But within a couple years, literally, I was kind of ticked, but yet happy when he had some friends of his over and he was showing them all the stuff we were doing on our farm. I'm thinking, we? We? But it made me feel good that he became a believer and so forth in that aspect. So, I don't know the dynamics of your situation. You gotta kind of know how to navigate that, but I hope that gives you some ideas.
There's a couple of questions in here, or their comments, just pointing out the Pennsylvania NRCS everywhere, I think, has cover crop cost share programs available, and pointing out or shouting out for the Maryland state cost share program. Delaware, their districts have one as well. So I just like to point that out, and to encourage people to check with their field offices if they're interested in those. Let's see, I'm going to go here to this one. Understand maintaining a living root principle, but if cover crop is taken for forage, thus removing the soil armor, what is the effect of removing that armor?
Well, there's where we go into compromises. And I'm just going to say there's no ideal system. If you have animals and you're going to feed them, my quick answer is you're probably going to plant something very quickly to replace that, because you are correct. The armor goes at that point. Now, what I have done, and it doesn't work all the time because I have pretty high biological activity, is if you have fields that don't always are taking forage off of it, and you have high C to N ratio cover crops. If you can grow a summer one, that would be like sorghum Sudan, that it can grow out and it can last literally in the soil for almost a year. Or if you have cereal rye that will go to head, or triticale that go to head, sometimes that can still cover the ground almost a year later. Not with legumes, they break down too quick, and there's a factor of how much biological activity you have in your soil. But if you're harvesting like double cropping, like typically a lot of dairy farms in my area here, now it's probably mainstream, planting a cereal rye or triticale, harvesting that as forage, and then go right back in and planting corn, taking that all for silage, spreading manure, repeat. So it is a little vulnerable during that time. And again, I come back to there is compromises, and usually in a system like that with those massive roots that are in there, that's doing a lot to help keep the soil in place. So nothing's perfect, but they're putting manure back, and usually the manure degrades fairly quickly, so it isn't there to necessarily protect the soil. I don't know, maybe Lisa, you want to chime in, because I know you work with a lot of growers that do this, so might be good to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Steve, you covered a lot of those main issues, and I don't know that I'd have too much to add at this point. But I always go back to that root system is still in place, so if you've got that cover crop established, even though you may be taking that off as your forage in the spring, or you're not going to have that residue and armoring on the top, you've still gotten the benefit out of that root system, out of feeding those microbes all those months out of the year, and supporting that soil system. So there's other benefits that come with that besides what's going on the top as well. So
let's see. We still have a couple of questions, and I don't know if these have been sufficiently covered, but I'll just throw it out there. Any other recommendations for cover crops with very cold climates or that short growing season?
Well, I did notice one of the questions in the chat, maybe I'll refer to it. I believe it came from Canada. talked about using barley as a forage. I'm assuming since it's in Canada, it's spring barley. The question was about adding Italian ryegrass to that. I'm going to defer that question to maybe someone in your local area. I'm going to suggest talking to someone like Kevin Elmy from Saskatchewan. He's well known in that area, that region for that kind of a question. So I'm going to just say that is one that I don't know, but I'm going to defer you to someone who may know more than me. That's a name I'll put out there. And you're just going to have to ask these questions around. I do know this, that there are dairy farms and those who are using forage and kind of a dual purpose cover crop / forage have looked at adding legumes to try to give a little more nitrogen to the grass, which is their bulk of their forage. And I will say that typically you don't get much more yield out of that. You might bump up your protein a little bit because it's a legume and has a little more protein in it. That's been a little tough to beat though, at least in our area here in central, I'll just say the mid-Atlantic region. It's hard to beat a rye or triticale that has manure on it for total tons taken off and the quality, I might add. We haven't been able to replace fertilizer. Some people, for whatever reason, maybe a field that's far away from their livestock operations, too far to haul manure. I hear that sometimes. They ask, can I just put legumes? And it's tough to keep up with the yields. They just tend to go to putting some nitrogen fertilizer on. There was a case where I wish that would work a little better, honestly, but I haven't seen that really come. There you're going to have to determine what type of farmer you are, how far you're going to push regenerative agriculture, how, again, you heard me say yesterday, it's not always about yield. If you have a specialty market that you can kind of use that to make up for a little bit less milk production per acre or higher quality milk, what have you. There's some options. I mean, I think we just heard yesterday that there's some of these specialty markets are getting up to $40 a hundred for milk. Well, I would certainly look into that, and then what does it require to do that? So maybe a little long-winded there on that question, but that's some of my response to that.
Okay. So we're going to turn this around for a second. I'm going to turn this back over to Lamont to set up another poll so we can hear a little bit and ask questions of our audience. And then again, while we're looking for those poll responses, I'll knock out a few more of these questions. So Lamont, let me turn it over to you here. Okay, so we've got two.
You see it there? And there's 2 questions in this poll. So once you answer the first one, be sure to go down to number 2.
And I see it has a note there that the host and panelists cannot vote. And I don't think that's quite fair, but that's okay.
I agree.
I agree too, Lamont.
Next time, we'll give you all the option. We can do that.
They just want to make sure I stay in my lane over here. Okay, I want to give people a chance to look at that and consider those. And there's a couple of sort of management specific questions that I think we can get to here. One is talking about soil compaction and how to fix ruts. So Steve, I'm not sure if you saw that, but they were looking at a very specific management practice using a roller when the fields are still wet enough to smooth things out. And so what's your opinion on this method? And do you have any other recommendations to smooth out ruts?
Well, this is where compromise plays its part. I'm a no-till farmer on my farm, 100% no-till. There have been occasions, and literally one time, where I had to cut out a 4-inch diameter tree that grew up through my disc and pull it out of the woods essentially because we had a few, it wasn't really ruts, but we had a harvest in wet conditions. But that was what I call cosmetic tillage. Makes me feel better. And it was just like an acre or so, not much at all. So having said that, there's reality here, especially in fields that lay wet, typically are wet, flatter fields. You have a wet fall, what are you going to do? And even some good long-term no-till fields, there's a certain point where that breaks down. So if you make ruts, my recommendation is remediate them with if you find out where the compaction is. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, but usually if you're making ruts with heavy equipment, you're talking about something you want to go down in 12 to 18 inches. Use something that is not really turns the soil over and turns it up, more like a subsoiler or a ripper with a colder in front. So you're just lifting the soil and kind of refracturing it. By the way, as much as you may be tempted, using deep rippers in wet conditions is not going to help you much at all. So there, you're going to have to wait till it dries out. But even if you rip, or you have to rip, even if you have to level it out with a disc or field cultivator or whatever, absolutely plant cover crops into that, because cover crops are going to take that to the final, a more healthy or more aggregate stability in your soil to kind of reset the soil, if you will. So just the least disturbance as possible, I guess I would say as deep as possible without maximizing or minimizing. You want to minimize your surface disturbance on that. I literally I have a picture of this, a neighbor of mine, only about 3 miles from me, that wet fall, we had a wet fall here in 2018. And he took a ripper just where he could physically see ruts from like a grain cart. And it was just like you see these sporadic places around the field. He wasn't tempted to rip the whole field, which I was proud of him for that. He just ripped the spots that were, because it was a long-term no-till field. So, if you theoretically, you could say you get a good cover crop planted in there, in a couple of years, you could fix that. There's ruts, but the reality of having ruts, you can't drive across them sometimes, so you got to fix them. So yeah, we're good with that. Just don't. My biggest concern is don't do the whole field if you don't need to. That's probably my biggest caution that I throw out about that.
Perfect. Lisa, I wanted to come back to you for a second. One of my farmers here in Delaware talks about how, in any given time, we're only 3 days away from a drought. Our soils are so sandy and just so the ability to infiltrate water is a huge benefit to improving soil health and organic matter here. And we rely a lot on an infiltration test in evaluating someone's soil health. So the test that you described, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, the time investment and what does it cost for somebody who might be interested in putting that out there as a service?
Sure. And I think there's 2 levels of the testing, depending on your goals. And if you're doing it for more scientific purposes or documenting for some sort of program documentation, you'll definitely want to use that double ring infiltrometer equipment. I think that's been scientifically proven. There's established methodologies out there, standard methodologies that have been accepted over the years, and present some more consistent data for those scientific documentation type purposes. The challenge with that is it requires a lot more water, because now instead of just filling a 6-inch ring, you're also filling that outer 12-inch ring. So from a logistical standpoint, if you can't drive into a field and you're carrying your equipment in there, big jugs of water get pretty tedious to carry over a long distance. So I think it depends on your purpose. If you're just doing it from an educational component, getting that kind of visual effect, that aha moment with the farmer, then I think that 6-inch infiltration ring certainly serves that purpose. It's easier to pound into the ground. It takes less water. And again, it's something and a piece of equipment that a farmer could actually build himself if they've got some sections of pipe laying around to cut that. So,
Okay.
but sandy soils are a challenge, you know, to build that organic matter and keep it there, because sometimes you can get too much infiltration too quickly in those sandy soils. Yeah.
We want it to soak in and hold on to it at the
Yeah.
same time. Yeah, thank you. Let's see, Lamont, I'm gonna come back to you. I saw you close the poll and I didn't know if it was ready to show the results yet. I guess so.
Here we go. There we are. So thank you all for filling this out. And with that first question, it was clear that soil health generally and cover crops are the leading topics that you all are interested in. But clearly some other topics are also of interest. And, you know, as Jen and I and Steve and other partners we have look at future webinars, this is very useful information for us. For example, I can see if we did this next year, we ought to do a session on soil testing, including some of these new techniques and tests to really drill down into soil health, the health of the soil versus more basic nutrient management and soil structure tests. So, and then in the next test or in the next question, it looks like over half of you are interested in expanding or maybe starting cover crop services to your clients. So that's interesting. And maybe some of you have your plates full already with other services that you're offering farmers. But hopefully this gave you, this week's content gives you some additional tools to take out to your clients. So thanks. And we also recognize that there are many of you on this call that actually are not a consultant, for example, but hopefully you've gathered a lot of useful information just for your own operations or for your own organizations. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lamont. So given the time that we have, and I know Steve had said that he could hang around a little bit for some time, and maybe we can address a few more of these questions, but I think it's a good time to check and see if anybody has any closing thoughts before we let people go who want to leave, and then anyone who wants to stay is definitely more than welcome to.
I'm good.
You're good. Well, and so I just really appreciate the expertise, kind of the social science that you introduced today. Steve, you know, those tips on how to communicate effectively. I think that's some news we can use sometimes, you know, in terms of reaching out to farmers. So with that.
And Jen, could I just jump in on that very point you just made?
Sure.
Because the presentation that Steve gave this morning hopefully was particularly useful for those of you who are doing direct farmer outreach or just education and outreach activities generally. But I would really like to leave you all with a thought that for those of you that don't think of yourself as a public speaker or a leader or a source of information for your local community, I would just encourage you all to evaluate that. We have, I think, some of the best field days and farmer programming in Pennsylvania as anywhere in the country. And a big reason for that is not really the experts that are comfortable speaking in front of people. It's actually because a lot of farmers have stepped up and realized that they have really, really important voices in this. And even though they might be nervous about speaking, hosting field day, whatever, they're going to do it because they know how important it is to spread this awareness. And no one listens. Farmers listen to other farmers more than anything else. And so if you have never thought of yourself as someone who would give a talk, think about that again. And you can start in your neighborhood, you could start at your church, you can start small, but think about helping us build this network of farmers and non-professionals as well as professionals in really spreading this awareness, soil health and soil conservation and water quality. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
I love that. Thank you.
Well said, Lamont.
Right? Okay, so I am going to put another note out there for everyone who is on the call today to look out for an email this afternoon from me it's a digital sign-in sheet for you to get your CCA credits or your state nutrient management credits, a short survey and a quiz, and also a link to a cover crop resource guide that Steve put together for technical advisors. It's really, really good. And so just keep an eye out for that. And we will see everyone tomorrow, unless you are remaining here for a few minutes, and we'll call it a day for today. So let's see. I will start at the top again here, Steve. So we only have, well, now we have 10. I think a couple of those are just kind of like a well done job today. So I don't know that we actually have 10 questions, but one that I hadn't gotten to before is, what are your thoughts on bush hogging cover crop to help with residue management?
Well, my first reaction to that, of hearing that, is bush hogging, meaning a rotary cutter type mower, typically doesn't tend to spread out the residue evenly. Maybe there's some units out there, at least the ones I've been familiar with, that's kind of a negative. If it's done, I do know of some situations where sorghum Sudan is grown in the summer, and there's actually been some research that shows if it's clipped, meaning it's just clipped off high, 8 inches high, it'll actually encourage the roots to grow deeper. It's kind of like what grazing does. And I've heard of people doing that because they didn't want big, huge biomass. They wanted more succulent, slower, that degrades quicker. I could see a use for a bush hog in a scenario like that. So there's options for it, I'll say, but probably cutting high. One of the things that we're kind of recognizing, and I'm finding a little weakness in some of my recommendations. You got to plant early, plant your cover crops early, follow the chopper. Well, we've been having some warm falls here, and guys are listening to me, and by November, the cereal rye is so thick it's starting to fall over because they want to grow forage, right? Particularly here in southeastern Pennsylvania, it's been somewhat of a problem. And some guys have gone in with a bush hog and clipped it off. Grazing would be ideal, to take it off a little bit, in order for it not to smother itself essentially over winter. If it starts going down, you have some snow and it, pushes it down, it can almost smother itself. So I can see a reason for bush hogging, but you better kind of know what you're doing there, so you don't get windrows or clumps that could cause issues later on.
Okay. There's a comment in here that I just have to address, that someone would encourage folks from Delaware and Eastern Shore, Maryland, to reach out to Sussex County SCD. Their field days are spectacular with a huge community involvement. And I just had to put that out there because it warms my heart, and I appreciate you so much. And that's not even a question, but I just had to come back to that.
Well, you deserve it there, Jen.
Let's see. So the top voted one here right now is kind of a can of worms that I'm going to come back to, and I'm going to go down to a third question. How do you seed cover crops with different size seed? Alternate seeders?
That's an excellent question, and it does depend on your equipment. If you have a grain drill that has small seed and large seed, that's sometimes not the answer you need, because typically it goes down through one tube and goes into the seed slot that's opened up. There are there's some brands of drills that allow you to take the small seeds and direct the tube right back near where it closes. So it kind of is sprinkled in right as it's closing, and it's kind of just under the soil surface, or even maybe on the soil surface, which can be okay in a seed slot like that. But if you have a drill that directs all the seed down into, one single depth, obviously, if you plant a crimson clover, a small seed, an inch deep, that could be a problem. But if you're planting peas, you'd like it to be an inch deep, or rye, or triticale, or anything else. That being said, there seems to be, especially if you have seeding rates enough, that with those larger seeds being planted a little deeper, they can help the smaller seeds be able to come up through. They kind of help each other in that regard. So this is a great question, but it hasn't been as much of a problem as you would think. So you don't always have to plant peas or cereal rye an inch deep. It'll grow, they'll grow at a 1/4 inch. Again, the problem we run into is if you have much residue, if you're planting at a 1/4 inch, your coulters or your double disc are not going deep enough to cleanly cut the residue. So even though I might sound like I'm beginning to contradict myself here a little bit, it hasn't been as much of a problem as you would think. I know when you actually particularly plant after corn harvest, grain corn, you're going to have, like, next to the road, it does depend on how your corn head was designed, if it has chopping unit, chopping stalk rolls or not. There's a lot of variables here, where you can be planting through a 2-inch thick residue of corn stalks, and then some parts of the road there's literally nothing. So when your drill is set, some of it's not going in the ground and some of it's going in 2 inches deep. That's an extreme, but it can happen. So I guess getting back to the question, I'm going to say a compromise here on a single depth is about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch is probably a good compromise. I have seen inch deep where I felt like I have lost some of my small seeds. They just didn't come up.
Okay.
So not a clear answer there for you, but that gives you some things to think about. I wouldn't, go too deep, I guess, and see what happens. It's probably not going to be as bad as you think in that regard.
Hey,
Okay.
Steve, can I add something to that too? And maybe you can chime in, but I think one of the other concerns in those seed mixes and the hoppers is you get that striation effect with the small seeds settling down to the bottom. So you can confirm what I'm about to say is true or not, but if you can slow down your planting speeds, so you're going a little slower and it's not as bumpy and you're not getting that agitation to settle out those smaller seeds. Or I've heard of some guys actually getting out, whatever, every 10 acres, 20 acres and physically mixing the seed in the hopper to help with those seed mixtures too.
Yeah, point well taken. I was actually thinking of saying that, then I decided not to.
Oh.
Nice you did. So the other thing too is sunflowers, if you use them as a cover crop, they'll tend to float to the top. They're lighter, and you're jingling around. Good advice. I will say that the separation of seeds has not been as much of a problem as you would think. It does depend on the types of seeds that you're mixing together. Like if you would have peas and radish and crimson clover, and maybe you threw a little bit of wheat in there or triticale, you might get some of them radishes and crimson clover. There's a lot of round seeds in there. You throw oats or something in there, a more longer seed. I guess I'll suffice it to say, the more types and sizes of seeds you have, the bigger variation, the less problem you're going to have. So if you're up into 5 or 6 different species, chances are you're not going to have much of a problem. But as you said, or some people, what we kind of like to do is if we have more than a drill's worth of seed to do. We'll mix it up. We'll put it in a bin wagon and we auger it into our drill. And, you know, you just make it half full. Sometimes that's inconvenient and you just don't fill it the whole way full. That's another factor. Depends on how many acres, how fast you need it done, all that. But again, it's not as bad as you might think, but something to keep in mind. Yes, you should get off the tractor once in a while and get back and look, see what it's looking like.
Okay, good, thank you. And I'm going to go back up to my can of beans up here at the top. In a no-till system, is putting manure on the top with no incorporation really a good thing? Is there a significant loss of nutrients, even with a cover crop to hold it in place? I've been told that without incorporation, it will volatilize.
Well, I want Lisa to follow me up here. Get ready, Lisa. So this was a big issue, I'm going to say, in the 80s and 90s. Lamont, you can probably address this too with the whole Chesapeake Bay awareness. I mean, I remember early on, it's like, well, you got to incorporate that manure, got to get in the ground. But wait, if we incorporate it, we're tilling, right? And then it's subject to erosion, and you're not really doing anything to help the situation. So where I come out on this is I would, the only reason for injecting manure, in my opinion, is if it's a smell issue in the community. You have a lot of suburbia or something. That could be a compelling reason there, just for whatever. The other thing is to set yourself up to have residue on the field and a living cover crop. And, you know, to this day, there's debates held by farmers, debates held between researchers, you know, all manure should be put on right before planting. Well, that's pretty much impossible for all of us to do that, in spite of its ideal. So backing up, having living cover and having 100% residue, I'm going to say, whether it's alive or previous crop residues, that's that's where we want to start from. And then as you get into this system where you have soil that can infiltrate, like dairy manure is pretty slurry, it goes in a little bit. Hog manure, you can soak it right up in a healthy soil. It can almost immediately go in, and you do pull in some of the volatility. It's not going to happen because it's gone in the soil. Granted, there will be volatility. A lot of that does have to do with temperature. So in the summertime, you're going to get more of the volatilized. That's basically more your loss than, I'm not sure how harmful that is to the atmosphere, really. I don't really know, but it's your loss. You know, ideally you could spread and you get like a 1/4 inch of rain and it kind of takes that nitrates just in the soil. But what if you get a 3-inch downpour and you just spread hours before and you're on a hillside? Sometimes it happens, but you set yourself up having a living cover, 100% residue, and just be smart about when you spread in the context of what your you know, situation is. So what did I miss there, Lisa?
Yeah, I think you touched on all those highlights. I was having that same thought process as you. It's really going to depend on the type of manure. You know, when you've got, even some dairies have a separated solid type system. So theirs is a very, very liquid type manure. And if you're managing, you got the good infiltration rates, like Steve said, that's going to soak in. You're going to have very little nitrogen loss with volatilizing that nitrogen. And then I don't want to discount the worm activity in the soil. You know, worms are Mother Nature's tillage. You know, so if fields have been under this style of management with the no-till and the cover crops and have really built up that worm population, it's really amazing how much worms can work those top couple inches of the soil and incorporate even a little bit more of that solid type manure residue that's on the field. Definitely, I think the more solids you have, the less immediate infiltration, you do have a higher risk of nitrogen loss through the volatilization.
The question had called out poultry and turkey litter too, and you know that's a big issue in my neck of the woods. And it's a very solid material. And I'll admit, I'm a little torn on how to handle that. You know, I think that gets back to what we've talked about with trade-offs and all of that. You know, that it does have to do with like timing, you know, where you are in reference to a rain event or something like that. But you know, I think that there's benefits and pros and cons on both sides, whether you incorporate it or you don't incorporate it, in terms of what you retain in terms of nutrient value versus the benefits that you get from tillage. So I would just say, you know, if you are going to incorporate that material, I understand and I respect that choice, and just to do it in the minimum disturbance, with the minimum disturbance that you need to, you know, to work that material in. So.
To
Jen,
that
I'll,
point- okay,
I'll tag on to that too. I think the other factor to consider, whether you're incorporated or not, are the slopes of your fields and the risk factor for having that exposed tilled soils. You know, Eastern Shore, you're going to have some flatter fields, lower slopes, so potentially the risk for erosion would be lower. Here in Pennsylvania, you know, we've got some pretty steep farm ground. So it's that trade-off of what's your risk of tillage and increasing the opportunity for soil erosion versus what nitrogen you may be gaining from the incorporation, you know.
So I was just going to say that one of the things that is occurring now is there are some pretty good minimal disturbance manure application rigs being built.
Yeah.
And that's great, but I got to tell you, it slows you down. And that's kind of like, is a farmer even want to pay for that? Someone's got to pay for that. That becomes an issue. So I'll just put it out there. They got some pretty good stuff out there now to get it in the ground if you need to do that.
And so about choices,
Yeah.
you know, yeah. Okay, so I feel like we've explored that topic. We do have a couple of questions in here about how you account for either soil tests, like soil health tests, or how you're accounting and measuring progress in soil health on your farm.
Okay, I'm not sure if I saw that. Is that actually referring to soil health tests?
Well, let's see. Let me go back up. So one, have you used soil health tests? Which ones and how do you use those results was one. And then let me go back down over here because I felt like that tied into a question building off your guidance with subsurface organic matter appreciation. Are there tools out there to accurately and efficiently measure that gain? So those two questions together.
Okay, well, I have to answer honestly. I've done about 1,500, that's 1,500 soil health tests in 2012, 2013, 2014. That was when they were just coming out, and we were working very diligently in the context of cover cropping. And we did very complex and comprehensive replicated throughout the year testing in that. After that 3-year time period, my opinion from what I saw, and this is my opinion, was that they weren't quite ready yet to make recommendations for fertility management. I didn't see the accuracy. We followed it to following the recommendations, and we also put, like in the context of nitrogen, we put 0 on, we put 200 pounds of nitrogen on corn just to see if the recommendation was accurate or not. And we got about a 60% accuracy rating. So I am the strongest supporter out there for soil health tests, and they have gotten better since then. And I have used them. And so more recently, and again, I'm not trying to pit soil health tests against each other. I'm just telling you my experience. I've been using the Cornell one, and the main reason I'm using it is because I'm involved with a grant to test it with the Pennsylvania Association of Sustainable Agriculture. So, because the Cornell is I'm going to say this again without endorsing anything, is maybe one of the more comprehensive ones out there, but it's definitely not farmer friendly. Takes way too much time and it costs a lot for every test. Not farmer friendly. I hope it will, but in the context of what I would say accurate results, I think they're onto something. There's more and more soil health tests coming out, and I think there will be more, and I hope they continue. I think they help us to maybe provide a benchmark of where our fields are right now compared to other fields in the region. It's just kind of nice to know. Am I doing anything that's making a difference? I mean, we can see stuff. We can see some things in our fields and so forth, but it is nice to have a test. But I will say we're not quite there yet where we are with more of the, I'm going to call it the chemistry test that tests phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, and there's nutrients, which they're not perfect either, by the way. But I liken them to the 3-day weather forecast. Kind of know what's going to happen 3 days from now. The soil health tests are like now the 5 to 7 day test, maybe longer. I'm not sure, but that just to give you an analogy. And it's nice to know because I do watch the 10-day forecast even throughout the winter because I like to know what's coming up next week. So it's helpful. So as far as the second part of the question and subsoil analysis and everything, you know, when you get to that point, you're starting to really literally dig deeper in management and so forth. I have actually done 7-foot deep tests on my farm. Again, with a grant, working with University of Maryland in that case. So that's just something that I could have never done and without some collaboration and the grant, by the way. So yes, I think that's in the future. I think you're going to see more of that. Soil health tests, there's all kinds of stuff. They're looking at DNA now. Someone really adamantly declared I had to try this DNA type testing, which there's a lot of rationale behind it. I won't go into it. And when I ducked the test and got the results back, it didn't make any sense at all to me. Nothing. I couldn't, and I called them up and said, what am I supposed to get from this? And they didn't know. So you have some of that out there yet too. And I was like, you get back to me when you figure this out. So anyway, I know Lisa, you've been involved in some, so that's a little bit of my experience.
Yeah, I'd like to just share with the group that this is a very timely topic, and the Soil Health Institute has had a North American-wide project for the last 3 years evaluating which parameters seem to be consistent indicators for soil health and are relating directly to some of these management practices. So they have wrapped up 3 years of collecting data at, like 110 or 130 research farms and other farms around North America. That is currently in the peer review process, and they're hoping to have some public recommendations come May or June of this year. But what seems to be rising to the top that they've found so far is soil organic carbon. So a little more specific than organic matter, but soil organic carbon, soil respiration, so either the 24-hour respiration test or the 96-hour, and that'll judge your microbial activity in your soils. Soil aggregate stability and Cornell's methodology. There's different ways to measure aggregate stability, but Cornell's method that they have developed seems to be rising to the top for accuracy. ACE soil protein levels and nitrogen mineralization, and then also active carbon, measuring that active carbon in the soil, which easily translate to the foods for the microbial community. So stay tuned. I think we're very close to this summer having some nationwide consistent guidance on which tests are worth spending the money on and seem to do the most accurate tracking with your management practices over time. So
Awesome. So what I would like to do now, I think, as we're starting to wind down, we've still got a few pretty like really good questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box. But I think we're also going to get to some of those over the next couple of webinars. And so if I can ask Lisa and Steve maybe just to take a peek in there and see if there's anything that you want to call out specifically or that you want to answer. If you know that it's quick or it's something that we're not necessarily going to get to over the next 2 days, just to have an opportunity to look at those before we wrap up for today.
I see one here from Brian about planting, tips for planting into cereal rye. It says overwintered cereal rye. I wonder if you might mean planting green into that. I'm going to assume that might be what that question is. First of all, as I indicated earlier, soybeans, it's hard to screw up. It literally, it works so easy. You could even, if it's wet, you can plant your beans and wait till they're up 2 or 3 inches before you go in and terminate either the roller or for herbicides, if you have traded beans. Corn, a different story, and I don't have time to go into it. But you got to have nitrogen with your corn. If you're into this system, if you're into this, I'm going to call it this system we've been talking about for a couple years, and you're not early. There are some guys who are completely doing away with nitrogen in rye, but you got to earn the right to do that. I don't recommend that if you're starting out particularly. So with corn, it's you want to have the rye down. If it's more than 12 inches, 18 inches tall, it needs to be rolled down so it can grow. And corn does not like any shade. So that's some of the key things: get nitrogen and get the rye down. Soybeans, it's you plant them and they just grow. You know, you get them in the ground, of course, but so that's a quick answer to that question I saw.
Okay. Lisa, anything that stands out to you there?
Yeah, I went through the chat, going through. I do think we'll have some opportunities to address some of these in the upcoming sessions,
Okay.
Jen. So, yeah, because we're almost a half an hour, but we've got 85 people that have stuck with us on the second half hour. So that's encouraging.
Bless you guys.
Yeah.
Yep. So Lamont, I'm going to come back to you here too. We had a question at the beginning that you brought up from James Biddle that it wanted to see if we had an answer on that.
Right. And before I get to that, Jen, I just want to point out, we were talking about pet peeves earlier, and small font is one of Steve's. Well, you said you referred to a can of worms as a bad thing. And I've always had a problem with that because that meant I was fishing. So just for future reference, particularly for a soil health crowd, you might want to come up with
I need a different metaphor.
Dude, Jen, I thought of that too, actually.
Oh,
We can forgive you this time. It's okay.
Now I know. So
yeah, right. So Jim's question was a really good one, and I'll try and summarize it, which is to say that if a farmer sells their carbon credits to some international buyer or local buyer for that matter, then doesn't that mean that those credits are no longer available for that farm for other purposes? And that is true at one level. When that buyer buys that value, it does now belong to them.
Right.
And then they are able to do a variety of different things with those credits that they purchase from the farm. But that does not mean that there aren't other ecosystem services that same field may be achieving, such as water-related credits, stormwater credits, for example. If a farm is within a municipality that's trying to accumulate stormwater credits. So that's one thing. There are going to be other credits, other markets, assuming that this ecosystem credits markets truly matures in the way we hope it does. So it's not like the value of that field goes away for other potential markets. And moreover, farms have a variety of needs for communicating the value of the changes or the farming systems that they use. Everything from being able to talk about what you're doing if you've got a roadside stand, to environmental compliance, to a host of other services. So but one other thing though that I think is really important about Jim's question is that if you as a farmer are considering selling credits in a big way, particularly permanent credits, you really want to make sure that you get good value for what you are selling, and that the buyer that you're working with is the best that you can come up with. But fortunately, we're on the leading edge of this. Most farmers have not even entered any kind of market like this yet, but it's something we're all learning about.
That's great. I definitely appreciate your diligence to clarify that question and develop that answer, you know, to dig that up. So with that, unless anybody has any closing comments, additional closing comments, I think we can wrap it up for today and come back for our session 3 tomorrow. Anything before we call it for today?
Good.
I'm good.
All right. Thank you, everybody who hung in there, and of course to our speakers and fellow coordinators. So we will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much.
See you, everyone.